The autumn rain fell in sheets across the village of Mizumoto, transforming the narrow streets into shallow rivers and the central square into a muddy pond. Takeshi adjusted his straw hat, the frayed edges dripping, and counted the few coins in his palm for the third time. 3 ryo remained from his summer's work, guarding a silk merchant's caravan. Barely enough for a month's lodging, less if he wanted to eat regularly. He had not planned to attend the village auction. Such events held little interest for a man who possessed nearly nothing and desired even less. But the rain had driven him to seek shelter beneath the auction pavilion's broad roof, where a small crowd had already gathered, drawn by rumors of unusual items from the capital. "Next," called the auctioneer, a thin man whose voice cracked with the strain of shouting over the rain. "We have a most unique offering, a young woman, daughter of the once noble Tachibana family." A murmur passed through the crowd as a slender figure was led to the platform. She wore a faded but once fine kimono, her face lowered, black hair falling to obscure her features. Behind her stumbled an older man in disheveled clothes that had once been elegant, his face flushed with sake and shame. "The girl is mute and deaf from birth," the auctioneer continued, gesturing toward the young woman who showed no reaction to his words or the crowd's whispers. "But she is accomplished in household arts, sewing, flower arranging, calligraphy. Her father, due to unfortunate circumstances, must part with her." The older man swayed slightly, avoiding the eyes of the villagers. Many knew him as Lord Tachibana, once a respected minor nobleman whose lands had been seized after backing the losing side in a provincial conflict. In the years since, he had descended into debt and drink, selling his possessions one by one until only his daughter remained. "Starting bid is 3 ryo, the auctioneer announced. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Few in the farming village had such sums to spare, and fewer still had need for a deaf-mute noblewoman, however accomplished. Takeshi watched the girl from beneath the shadow of his hat. Though her face remained downturned, he noted the elegant line of her neck, the dignified stillness with which she stood beside her swaying father. Despite her circumstances, she maintained the composed bearing of nobility, a quality Takeshi recognized from his years serving a daimyo before becoming ronin. "No interest at 3 ryo? The auctioneer's voice took on a note of desperation. "Very well, we'll start at 2. 3 ryo, Takeshi called, the words escaping before he had fully formed the thought. The crowd turned, surprised to hear the voice of the ronin who had appeared in their village a week prior and spoken to almost no one. Takeshi himself seemed equally startled by his intervention. The auctioneer's face brightened. 3 ryo from the samurai, do I hear 4? Silence fell, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on the pavilion roof. No other bids came. "Sold to the samurai for 3 ryo, the auctioneer declared with evident relief. Lord Tachibana looked up briefly, his bloodshot eyes meeting Takeshi's for an instant. Something passed between them, a wordless communication, man to man, before shame forced the nobleman's gaze back to the muddy ground. With a quick formal bow to his daughter's back, and a less steady one to Takeshi, he turned and stumbled away into the rain without a backward glance. The young woman had not moved, had given no indication that she understood what had transpired. The auctioneer guided her forward with a light touch on her elbow, bringing her to stand before Takeshi. "Her name is Miyuki," he said, accepting Takeshi's coins. At least that's what her father called her. Takeshi nodded, suddenly at a loss. What did one do after purchasing a person? The absurdity of his situation struck him forcefully. He was a masterless samurai with no home, no prospects, and barely enough coin to feed himself. Now he had spent his last money on a deaf-mute noblewoman who likely had never cooked a meal or washed a garment in her life. "Come," he said awkwardly, then remembered she supposedly couldn't hear. He lightly touched her sleeve instead, gesturing toward the street. To his surprise, she followed without hesitation, moving with the precise, graceful steps of one trained in court etiquette. Together they walked through the rain toward the modest inn, where Takeshi had taken a room, an odd pair drawing curious glances from villagers sheltering in doorways. The innkeeper, a plump woman named Sato, with kind eyes and a practical disposition, looked up as they entered, water streaming from their clothes to puddle on the wooden floor. "Takeshi-san," she greeted him, eyes widening at the sight of his companion. The auction, was it? I hadn't thought you a man in need of possessions. Neither had I, he replied with a wry twist of his lips. Sato studied the young woman, noting her downturned face and fine-boned hands. She's a Tachibana, isn't she? Poor thing, her father's fall has been hard to witness. She lowered her voice. They say she's been deaf since birth, never spoken a word. So I was told. Takeshi glanced at Miyuki, who showed no reaction to their conversation. I need to speak with you privately, Sato-san. The innkeeper nodded, understanding immediately. Of course, young lady, let me show you to the bath. You must be chilled from the rain. She took Miyuki's arm gently and led her toward the back of the inn. Miyuki followed docilely, her face still hidden behind the curtain of her damp hair. Once they were gone, Takeshi sank onto a cushion near the Irori hearth at the center of the room, the weight of his impulsive decision settling fully upon him. Sato returned moments later, settling across from him with an expression that mingled curiosity and concern. I've acted rashly, Takeshi said without preamble. Indeed, she agreed, though some might call it kindness. Not kindness, foolishness. He stared into the glowing coals. I have no home to offer her, no means to provide properly. I spent my last coins on her. Why then? The question hung between them, and Takeshi found himself unable to articulate a clear answer. Something about the young woman's dignity, amid humiliation, had stirred memories of another life, when he had stood proud in service to a worthy lord, before war and death had stripped everything away. It doesn't matter, he said finally. What's done is done. But I must find a solution. Sato considered him thoughtfully. My sister owns a tea house in Hagi. She often seeks well-bred young women to serve her more refined customers. The girl's condition would not matter much there, as long as she carries herself well and follows instruction, which, being of noble birth, she likely can. Hagi is 10 days' journey on foot, 9 for a man who walks as you do. Sato smiled slightly. My nephew leaves tomorrow with a merchant caravan bound for the coast. They pass through Hagi. He could deliver a letter to my sister, and you could follow with the girl at your own pace. Takeshi nodded slowly. That would be most helpful, Sato-san. I would be in your debt. Consider it repayment for how you dealt with those troublemakers last week. She rose, smoothing her apron. Now, about your immediate situation. The girl can share my daughter's room tonight. As for tomorrow and after, she hesitated. I cannot offer charity, Takeshi-san. My margins are too thin. I understand. I'll find work in the morning. The blacksmith mentioned needing help. His apprentice broke an arm 3 days past. With that practical suggestion, she left to check on Miyuki and prepare the evening meal. Takeshi remained by the hearth, contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. 3 years a ronin, drifting from village to town, taking what honest work he could find, avoiding attachments of any kind. Now, with one impulsive bid, he had assumed responsibility for another life, one more vulnerable than his own. Later, when Miyuki returned from the bath dressed in a simple cotton yukata, loaned by Sato's daughter, Takeshi got his first clear look at her face. She was younger than he had guessed, perhaps 19 or 20, with delicate features and dark eyes that seemed to look through rather than at him. A small crescent-shaped scar marked her right temple, disappearing into her hairline. He gestured for her to sit across from him at the low table where Sato had laid out a simple meal of rice, grilled fish, and pickled vegetables. She knelt gracefully, hands folded in her lap, waiting. Takeshi hesitated, uncertain how to communicate. After a moment, he simply picked up his chopsticks and began to eat, gesturing for her to do the same. She ate sparingly, with the refined manners of aristocracy, confirming what Takeshi had already surmised about her upbringing. Throughout the meal, her gaze remained lowered, her expression unreadable. When they had finished eating, he decided to test what he had been told about her condition. Miyuki-san, he said clearly, watching her face. My name is Takeshi. I was once a samurai of the Asakura clan. No reaction. Not the slightest flicker of recognition crossed her features. I'm traveling north toward Hagi, he continued. There may be a position for you there, at a tea house owned by the innkeeper's sister. Still nothing. Either she truly could not hear or she was a consummate actress. Given her noble upbringing, Takeshi knew that self-control would have been instilled from earliest childhood, but what reason would she have to pretend? Giving up on direct communication for the night, he gestured toward where Sato waited to show her to her sleeping quarters. Miyuki rose smoothly and followed the innkeeper, pausing only to bow formally to Takeshi before disappearing down the hallway. Left alone, Takeshi pondered the day's events until the Irori's coals burned low, casting the common room in shadows. Tomorrow he would seek work with the blacksmith. If all went as planned, within a few days, they would begin the journey to Hagi, where he could deliver Miyuki to a safe position before continuing his solitary wandering. A simple, practical solution to an admittedly unusual problem. Yet as he prepared his own sleeping mat, Takeshi found himself troubled by an inexplicable sense of unease, as if he had overlooked something significant about the silent young woman now under his protection. Morning arrived with clearing skies and birdsong. Takeshi rose early, as was his habit, and found Sato already preparing breakfast in the kitchen. To his surprise, Miyuki was there as well, efficiently slicing vegetables and shaping rice balls under the innkeeper's direction. "She appeared at dawn," Sato explained, noticing his questioning look. "Seems she's not unfamiliar with kitchen work, despite her breeding. She watches and copies perfectly." Indeed, Miyuki's movements were precise and practiced, suggesting this was not her first time preparing a meal. Another contradiction to the narrative of a sheltered noblewoman. After breakfast, Takeshi left for the blacksmith's workshop, while Miyuki remained at the inn, helping Sato with household tasks. The blacksmith, a burly man named Jiro with burn-scarred forearms, was initially skeptical of employing a ronin, but quickly reassessed when he saw Takeshi's strength and discipline. By midday, they had reached an agreement. 4 days' work for enough coin to cover inn expenses and provision the journey to Hagi. When Takeshi returned to the inn that evening, exhausted and smudged with soot, he found Miyuki seated on the Engawa, watching the sunset with a stillness that seemed almost meditative. She had bathed and changed back into her own kimono, now cleaned and mended, her hair arranged neatly. In the golden light of dusk, with her perfect posture and serene expression, she looked every bit the noblewoman she was by birth, if not by current circumstance. For a moment, Takeshi simply observed her, struck by the contrast between her composed exterior and the turmoil she must surely feel within. Sold by her own father, purchased by a stranger, her future uncertain. Yet nothing in her demeanor betrayed distress or fear. She must have sensed his presence, despite her supposed deafness, for she turned her head slightly in his direction. When he stepped onto the Engawa, she rose and bowed with formal respect before following him inside for the evening meal. This pattern continued for 3 days, Takeshi working at the forge from dawn until dusk, returning to find Miyuki calmly integrated into the inn's daily rhythms. Sato reported that she was an excellent helper, intuiting needs before they were expressed and completing tasks with quiet efficiency. The innkeeper's daughter had taken to teaching her simple games in the evenings, communicating through gestures and demonstrations that Miyuki followed with surprising quickness. On the 4th evening, as they prepared to depart the following morning, Sato presented Miyuki with a small bundle. "Traveling clothes," she explained to Takeshi, "more practical than her kimono for the road, and some provisions for your journey." She handed him a folded paper. "The letter for my sister. She's expecting you in approximately 2 weeks." "Thank you for your kindness," Takeshi said with a formal bow. "It's not kindness but practicality," Sato replied, echoing his own earlier words with a knowing smile. "The girl works hard and learns quickly. My sister will benefit from her service." Her expression softened as she looked at Miyuki. "Take care on the road, child. Mind Takeshi-san's instructions." Though Miyuki couldn't hear the words, she seemed to understand the sentiment, returning Sato's concerned look with a deep, respectful bow. They departed at dawn the next day, Takeshi carrying his few possessions, plus the provisions in a pack slung over his shoulder, his swords at his hip. Miyuki walked 3 paces behind him, dressed in the plain cotton kimono and straw sandals Sato had provided, a small bundle of her own belongings tied neatly in a furoshiki. The road north wound through terraced rice fields, golden with approaching harvest, small farming villages, and stretches of forest where maple leaves had begun their autumn transformation. They maintained a steady pace, stopping at midday to rest and eat from their provisions, resuming until dusk approached and they sought shelter. Sometimes they stayed at roadside inns, where Takeshi's remaining coins secured them modest accommodations. More often, they slept in simple travelers' shelters or empty shrines along the way. Throughout, Miyuki followed Takeshi's lead without complaint, matching his pace and adapting to whatever circumstances they encountered. Communication remained their greatest challenge. Takeshi had developed a system of gestures to convey basic directions: come, stay, eat, sleep, which Miyuki comprehended instantly. For more complex matters, he resorted to drawing characters in the dirt or dust with a stick, which she read and responded to with small nods or shakes of her head. It was an imperfect system, but sufficient for their practical needs. What troubled Takeshi was his inability to learn anything about Miyuki herself, her thoughts, feelings, history, beyond the bare facts he already knew. The barrier of her silence and seeming deafness created a one-sided relationship that left him increasingly uneasy as the days passed. On the sixth night of their journey, they took shelter in an abandoned woodcutter's hut as a sudden storm lashed the forest around them. The single-room structure was dusty but intact, offering protection from the rain and wind that howled outside. Takeshi built a small fire in the central hearth, its light casting long shadows across the rough wooden walls. They ate a simple meal of rice balls and dried fish, then prepared for sleep on opposite sides of the hut, as had become their custom. Takeshi had just settled onto his sleeping mat when a particularly violent gust of wind shook the hut, dislodging something from the rafters above. A bundle of dried herbs, long forgotten by the hut's previous occupant, fell directly onto the fire. The herbs ignited with a sudden flare and a sharp, aromatic crack. Takeshi was reaching to remove them when he noticed something extraordinary. Miyuki had flinched at the sound, her head turning instinctively toward the noise before she caught herself and resumed her impassive expression. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable, and impossible for someone truly deaf. Takeshi froze, his mind racing. It could have been coincidence. Perhaps she had seen the flare of light and responded to that. But her reaction had come too quickly, oriented too precisely toward the source of the sound. Carefully, maintaining a casual demeanor, he settled back onto his sleeping mat and observed her from beneath half-closed eyelids. Miyuki had composed herself once more, preparing her own bedding with the same quiet efficiency she brought to all tasks. When she had settled and appeared to be drifting towards sleep, Takeshi waited until her breathing deepened before making his move. In one swift, deliberate motion, he drew his wakizashi from its sheath, the steel making its distinctive singing sound as it cleared the scabbard. Miyuki's eyes flew open instantly, her body tensing before she controlled the reaction. But it was too late. Takeshi had seen the truth. "You can hear," he said quietly, resheathing his blade. For several heartbeats, Miyuki remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. Then slowly she sat up and faced him across the fire, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but clear, unused but not unpracticed. "I can hear and speak, as you now discover." The shock of hearing her voice after days of silence momentarily robbed Takeshi of words. When he found his voice again, he asked the obvious question: why pretend otherwise? Miyuki's hands tightened in her lap, the only sign of tension in her otherwise composed demeanor. "At first, it was my father's idea. He believed a deaf-mute daughter would fetch a higher price. Exotic, mysterious, a conversation piece for a wealthy household. He thought it might." She hesitated. "Mask other perceived deficiencies in my value." "What deficiencies?" Takeshi asked, genuinely puzzled. From what he had observed, Miyuki possessed every quality a household would value: diligence, intelligence, refined manners, and considerable domestic skills. A bitter smile touched her lips. "I have opinions, Takeshi-san, and knowledge. My father allowed me an education far beyond what is typical for daughters. even in noble houses. I can read and write not only Japanese but Chinese classics as well. I studied poetry, history, even some aspects of governance and strategy that my brothers found tedious. She looked down at her hands. Such qualities are not universally admired in a woman. When our fortunes fell and marriage arrangements collapsed, my father found my mind an impediment to securing another match. Men of quality wanted beauty and compliance, not intellect and education. So he decided to sell you as a curiosity, rather than seek another marriage alliance. Takeshi couldn't keep the edge from his voice. The sake decided that, Miyuki replied simply. My father was not always the man you glimpsed at the auction. Before our clan's defeat, before the land was taken and my brothers killed in battle, he was a different person, honorable, kind. The drink hollowed him out until only desperation remained. Takeshi absorbed this, recognizing the familiar pattern of a man undone by circumstances and his own weaknesses. He had seen it often enough in the years after his own lord's defeat and death. But why maintain the pretense with me, he asked, after your father was gone? Here Miyuki hesitated, studying him carefully before answering. I didn't know you or your intentions. A young woman alone with a ronin on the road is vulnerable. Being perceived as deaf offered a kind of protection, a way to observe without being expected to respond. Her gaze was direct now, unflinching. It allowed me to learn your character before revealing myself. And what have you learned? Takeshi asked, curious despite himself. That you are honorable if somewhat reckless with your resources. The hint of a genuine smile softened her features. That you are kind to innkeepers and respectful to blacksmiths. That you rise before dawn and practice sword forms when you think no one is watching. That you assume responsibility even when it brings you no advantage. Her assessment was uncomfortably perceptive, making Takeshi wonder what else she had observed during their days together. So why reveal yourself now? You could have maintained the deception until Hagi. Because I don't wish to go to Hagi, Miyuki said simply. What? This was unexpected. The tea house is a good position. You would be safe there, treated well, serving tea and entertaining merchants for the rest of my days. She shook her head. That is not the life I want, Takeshi-san. What life do you want? He asked, genuinely curious now. Miyuki was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. I want to use my mind, not just my ability to pour tea gracefully. I want to rebuild what was lost, not the lands or title perhaps, but the purpose. My father's house stood for something once. We administered justice in our region, supported artisans and scholars, maintained peace. Ambitious goals for a ronin's purchase, Takeshi observed, though without mockery. Says the ronin who spent his last coins on a deaf-mute noblewoman, she countered, a surprising spark of humor in her voice. Despite himself, Takeshi smiled. In the dancing firelight, with her intelligence and determination now visible in her expression, Miyuki seemed transformed, no longer the passive, silent figure who had followed him for days, but a woman of substance and complexity. If not Hagi, then where? He asked finally. I made a commitment to deliver you to safety and suitable employment. I won't abandon that responsibility. I have family in Kyoto, distant cousins on my mother's side who may not have heard of our disgrace, or who might overlook it given my education and skills. She leaned forward slightly, earnestness in her expression. I can serve as a tutor to their children, a household manager, even a scribe for correspondence. Any of these would be more suitable than pouring tea for merchants who expect. Additional services. Takeshi frowned. Sato-san's sister runs a respectable establishment. Even in respectable tea houses, beautiful young women without protection are vulnerable. Miyuki's tone was matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. Particularly those without family connections or the ability to cry out for help. The implication was clear, and Takeshi felt a rush of shame that he hadn't considered this aspect of the arrangement. He had been focused on the practical solution, finding Miyuki a position, without fully contemplating what that position might entail. Kyoto is 30 days' journey from here, he said after a moment's calculation. Longer in the approaching winter weather. I have provisions for perhaps another week. Coin for little more than that. I can work along the way, Miyuki suggested. I'm skilled at sewing, can assist in kitchens as you've seen. Perhaps teach calligraphy or poetry to village children whose parents aspire to culture. A noble woman working as an itinerant teacher. Takeshi couldn't keep the skepticism from his voice. A survivor using her abilities to move forward, she corrected gently. As you have done, taking work with blacksmiths and merchants instead of seeking death when your lord fell. Her insight struck uncomfortably close to home. After losing his position, many of Takeshi's fellow samurai had chosen seppuku rather than face life without purpose or master. He had considered it himself in the darkest moments, but ultimately chosen to continue, to adapt, to find meaning in smaller services and modest labors. Kyoto, he said finally, testing the idea. Winter in the mountains between here and there will be harsh. We could take the coastal route, Miyuki suggested. Longer but safer in the cold months. The ease with which she said we gave Takeshi pause. You assume I will accompany you? She met his gaze steadily. You purchased me, Takeshi-san. Until I am delivered to a suitable situation or formally released, I remain your responsibility, whether I am deaf or not. There was a logic to her argument that Takeshi couldn't refute, though he suspected there was more behind her words than simple legal technicality. A lone woman traveling to Kyoto would face dangers beyond weather and terrain. Bandits, unscrupulous officials, predatory fellow travelers, all would see her as an easy target without male protection. We'll discuss it further in the morning, he said finally. For now, we should rest. The storm seems to be passing. Indeed, the wind had died down to an occasional gust, the rain reduced to a gentle patter on the hut's roof. Miyuki nodded her acceptance of the temporary deferral and settled back onto her sleeping mat. But before closing her eyes, she spoke once more. Thank you, Takeshi-san. For what? He asked, surprised. For being the kind of man I could reveal myself to without fear. With that simple statement, she turned away, leaving Takeshi to contemplate her words as the fire burned down to glowing embers. Sleep was long in coming. Morning brought clear skies and difficult decisions. Over a simple breakfast of the last rice balls from their provisions, Takeshi considered their situation. The practical choice remained Hagi, closer with guaranteed employment waiting. Yet he found himself increasingly convinced by Miyuki's preference for Kyoto, despite the challenges it presented. If we take the coastal route to Kyoto, he said finally, we'll need to earn our way. I won't promise success. Miyuki's face brightened with restrained hope. Then we're going? We'll try, Takeshi qualified. The journey may prove too difficult. If so, we reserve the option of seeking employment in towns along the way. Agreed. She smiled fully for the first time in his presence, transforming her features from merely beautiful to radiant. Thank you, Takeshi-san. Don't thank me yet, he cautioned. The real challenges lie ahead. Those challenges emerged sooner than either expected. They had been traveling the coastal road for 3 days when they encountered their first significant obstacle, a checkpoint where officials were examining travelers' papers and collecting road taxes. Takeshi observed the checkpoint from a distance, noting the bored efficiency with which the guards processed merchants, farmers, and other ordinary travelers. As a Ronin accompanying a young woman with no documentation of identity or travel permission, they would certainly draw unwelcome scrutiny. We'll need to bypass it, he told Miyuki, who stood beside him now, rather than the customary 3 paces behind. Since her revelation in the woodcutter's hut, their dynamic had shifted subtly but significantly. There should be smaller paths through those hills. Miyuki studied the terrain thoughtfully. The checkpoint is there because this is the easiest crossing point. The hills will be steep, possibly dangerous. Less dangerous than officials' questions, Takeshi replied grimly. They backtracked and found a narrow trail leading up into the forested hills that paralleled the coastal road. The path was indeed steep and poorly maintained, clearly not intended for regular travel. By midday they were high enough to see the sea beyond the checkpoint, glittering in the autumn sun. We should be able to rejoin the main road beyond the checkpoint by evening, Takeshi estimated, pausing to let Miyuki rest. Though she had proven remarkably resilient during their journey, the difficult terrain was taking its toll. She nodded, catching her breath. I've been thinking about our immediate future. We need funds if we're to reach Kyoto before winter deepens. There should be fishing villages along the coast where I can find work, Takeshi said. Enough to replenish our provisions at least. And I've been considering what skills I might offer, Miyuki continued. In larger towns, there may be merchant families willing to pay for their daughters to learn proper tea ceremony, flower arrangement, calligraphy, the accomplishments expected of women with aspirations to refinement. Takeshi raised an eyebrow. You would reveal yourself as a Tachibana. Your family name, while fallen, still carries certain associations. I thought perhaps I might use my mother's family name, Kamiya, less recognizable with fewer political implications. She gave him a considering look. And you? Will you continue as Takeshi the Ronin, or do you have an alternative identity to propose? The question startled him. In 3 years of wandering, he had never considered adopting another name or history. His identity as a masterless samurai of the defeated Asakura clan was a burden, but also a truth he had never thought to set aside. For now, I remain as I am, he said after a moment, though perhaps without emphasizing my clan affiliations. They continued their journey, eventually circumventing the checkpoint and rejoining the coastal road as dusk approached. The following days fell into a pattern, traveling by day, seeking shelter and work in villages and small towns along the route. Takeshi found occasional employment loading fishing boats, mending nets, or performing other physical labor that required more strength than skill. More surprising was the success of Miyuki's proposal. In larger settlements, she discreetly offered lessons in refined arts to merchants' daughters, creating small but welcome additions to their travel funds. Her students were typically girls of 13 to 16, whose families harbored ambitions of advantageous marriages or business connections with samurai houses. My daughter needs to know proper tea ceremony, one prosperous silk merchant explained as he engaged Miyuki's services. My business takes me to daimyo residences, where she may accompany me one day. She must not embarrass our family. Miyuki taught with patience and precision, drawing on her own extensive training. She never claimed Tachibana lineage but allowed her manners and knowledge to suggest noble origins, which enhanced her credibility with status-conscious clients. Takeshi, observing one such lesson from a respectful distance, was impressed by her ability to adapt her extensive education to her students' more practical needs. As they traveled, the dynamic between them continued to evolve. Miyuki no longer followed behind Takeshi, but walked beside him, engaging in conversations that ranged from practical travel concerns to more philosophical discussions about duty, honor, and the changing world around them. The old order is collapsing, she observed one evening, as they shared a simple meal in a roadside inn. Clans that stood for centuries are falling. New powers emerge from unexpected quarters. It has always been thus, Takeshi replied. The strong replace the weak. Only the names change. Miyuki considered this. Perhaps, but I wonder if something more fundamental isn't shifting. My father spoke of foreign ships appearing with increasing frequency, barbarians with strange weapons and stranger ideas. I've heard the same rumors, Takeshi acknowledged, though I've never seen these foreigners myself. Nor I. But their influence seeps inward from the coast, even when they themselves are not permitted to enter. She traced a pattern on the table with one finger. Power defined solely by martial strength may be giving way to power derived from commerce, knowledge, adaptability. You speak like a court philosopher, Takeshi said with a small smile. I read too many Chinese classics as a girl, she admitted, returning his smile. My brothers teased me mercilessly for it. These glimpses into her past were rare and therefore precious. Despite their growing comfort with each other, Miyuki seldom spoke of her life before her family's fall, and Takeshi respected her reticence, offering little of his own history in return. Yet a bond was forming between them, one based on shared experience and mutual respect, rather than the transaction that had initially brought them together. They had been traveling for nearly 3 weeks, making steady if slow progress toward Kyoto, when disaster struck in the form of early winter storms. The coastal region was battered by winds and driving rain that turned to sleet as temperatures dropped. Travel became increasingly difficult, forcing them to remain in a small fishing village for 5 days while waiting for conditions to improve. Their funds, carefully accumulated through work along the way, began to dwindle as they paid for extended lodging and meals. When the weather finally cleared enough to continue, they set out with the knowledge that they were now racing against both winter's advance and their limited resources. 2 days later, they reached a town of moderate size where they hoped to find work substantial enough to replenish their travel funds. The town served as a trading hub for the surrounding region, with a small but active commercial district centered around a marketplace. While Takeshi inquired about employment opportunities at warehouses and transportation companies, Miyuki visited shops catering to the town's more affluent residents, offering her services as a tutor in refined arts. By evening, both had secured modest prospects. Takeshi would assist a rice merchant in moving and organizing his winter stores, while Miyuki had arranged to teach 3 young women whose father operated a profitable silk-weaving business. They took lodging at a simple inn near the marketplace, planning to remain for at least a week while they worked and saved. Their room was small but clean, with 2 sleeping mats, a low table, and a brazier for warmth. Modest comfort that nonetheless felt luxurious after days on the road in harsh weather. On their 3rd day in town, as Takeshi was returning from his work at the rice merchant's warehouse, he noticed an unusual degree of activity around the central administrative building. Officials in formal attire came and went, while a group of samurai bearing an unfamiliar crest stood guard at the entrance. Curious, he stopped at a tea stall in the marketplace, ordering a cup of the hot beverage as a pretense for conversation with the proprietor. "Much activity at the magistrate's office today," he observed casually. The tea seller, an elderly man with a network of wrinkles mapping his face, nodded eagerly. "Important visitors from the capital, representatives of Lord Miyoshi himself, they say." Takeshi maintained his casual demeanor, though the name sent a chill through him. The Miyoshi clan had been instrumental in the defeat of his former lord, the Asakura. More concerning still, they had been allies of the Tachibana's enemies in the provincial conflict that had led to Miyuki's family's downfall. "What business brings Miyoshi representatives to this remote town?" he asked, sipping his tea. "Tax collection officially," the old man replied, leaning closer with the air of one sharing privileged information. "But rumor has it they're also searching for fugitives, political enemies who fled the capital during recent purges." Takeshi thanked the man for both the tea and conversation before continuing back to the inn, his mind racing with implications. If Miyoshi representatives were in town, especially those empowered to identify and apprehend political fugitives, Miyuki's presence became considerably more dangerous. While her father's disgrace had been local, the Tachibana name was known well enough that someone might make the connection, particularly if they were specifically alert for displaced nobility. He found Miyuki at the inn, reviewing calligraphy samples she had prepared for the next day's lesson with her students. She looked up with a smile that quickly faded as she registered his expression. "What's happened?" Takeshi closed the door carefully before speaking, keeping his voice low. "Miyoshi representatives are in town, including samurai." The color drained from Miyuki's face. "Miyoshi, you're certain?" "I saw the crest myself. They're supposedly collecting taxes, but also searching for political fugitives." She set down her brush with deliberate care, composing her features through visible effort. "The Miyoshi were instrumental in my father's downfall. Their alliance with Lord Kuroda gave them the pretext needed to seize our lands. We should leave at first light," Takeshi decided. "Work and payment can be found elsewhere." Miyuki nodded her agreement, then hesitated. "But leaving suddenly might attract attention itself. Travelers arriving is common. Travelers departing after just 3 days, less so." It was a valid concern. In a town this size, newcomers were noticed, particularly a ronin and a young woman of obviously refined manners. Abrupt departure might raise questions where none had existed before. "We'll need a credible reason," Takeshi acknowledged. "Family illness in a nearby village, perhaps." They spent the evening planning their departure, carefully balancing the need for haste against the importance of avoiding suspicion. They would inform their respective employers of a sudden summons to attend a sick relative, apologize for the inconvenience, and leave before the town fully awakened. But fate, or perhaps merely ill fortune, intervened before their plan could be executed. Shortly after dawn, as they were preparing to depart, A commotion erupted in the inn's courtyard. Takeshi peered through the window to see 4 samurai bearing the Miyoshi crest confronting the innkeeper, who gesticulated nervously toward the building's interior. "They're here for us," he said quietly, turning to Miyuki. "The rear window is our only exit." Miyuki was already gathering their few possessions, her movement swift but controlled. "How did they find us?" "It doesn't matter now." Takeshi checked that his swords were secure, then helped Miyuki with her bundle. "Once we're clear of the town, we'll head into the hills. They may have horses, but the terrain will slow them." The window was small but adequate for their purpose. Takeshi went first, dropping silently into the narrow alley behind the inn, then helping Miyuki descend. They had just started moving toward the alley's end when shouts from inside the inn indicated their absence had been discovered. "Run!" Takeshi ordered, abandoning stealth for speed. They fled through back streets, avoiding the more populated areas where early-rising merchants and laborers were beginning their day. Takeshi led them toward the town's eastern edge, where forested hills rose steeply, offering potential concealment. But the Miyoshi samurai were well-trained and determined. As Takeshi and Miyuki reached the last cluster of buildings before open ground would leave them exposed, the sound of pursuit grew louder behind them. A quick glance revealed 2 samurai closing the distance, with others visible further back. "I'll delay them," Takeshi decided, pushing Miyuki toward the tree line at the foot of the hills. "Make for the forest, I'll find you." "No," she protested, grasping his arm. "They'll kill you." "They'll try," he corrected grimly, his hand moving to his katana's hilt. "Now go. Every moment counts." For a heartbeat, Miyuki hesitated, conflict evident in her expression. Then, with a quick nod, she turned and ran toward the forest, her gray traveling clothes blending with the morning mist that clung to the ground. Takeshi faced their pursuers, drawing his katana with the fluid motion ingrained by years of training. The 2 lead samurai slowed as they approached, assessing him with professional caution. They were younger than Takeshi, but well-armed and armored in the light but effective style favored by Miyoshi forces. "Surrender the Tachibana girl," the first samurai called, "and you may live, Ronin." So they knew exactly who they sought. Takeshi's suspicion that someone had recognized Miyuki, perhaps one of her students or their parents, seemed confirmed. "I know no one by that name," he replied calmly, settling into his stance. "Lying only adds to your crimes," the second samurai said, drawing his own weapon. "Lord Miyoshi has ordered all remaining Tachibana brought to justice for their treason." "Difficult to commit treason against a lord to whom one owes no allegiance," Takeshi observed. The comment was deliberately provocative, designed to anger his opponents and potentially cloud their judgment. It worked, at least partially. The first samurai attacked with a cry of outrage, his blade sweeping down in a powerful overhead strike that would have cleaved Takeshi from shoulder to hip had it landed. But Takeshi was no longer where the blow fell, having stepped aside with the practiced economy of movement that had kept him alive through years of warfare. His counterstrike was swift and precise, finding the gap between the samurai's breastplate and shoulder guard. The man staggered back with a cry of pain, his sword arm hanging useless at his side. The second samurai was more cautious, circling to Takeshi's left while waiting for his companions to arrive. But Takeshi could not afford a prolonged engagement. Every moment he delayed here was a moment for Miyuki to increase her distance, but also a moment for more Miyoshi forces to join the fight. He feinted to draw a response, then launched a series of strikes so rapid and fluid that the younger samurai could only retreat, desperately parrying. When an opening appeared, just a momentary gap in the man's defense, Takeshi's blade found it unerringly, slipping past the guard to open a deep gash across the samurai's thigh. With both immediate opponents disabled, though not mortally wounded, Takeshi turned and ran toward the forest where Miyuki had disappeared. Behind him, he could hear shouts as the remaining Miyoshi samurai discovered their injured comrades and organized a more determined pursuit. The forest was dense at its edge, with underbrush that tore at clothing and skin, but opened up beneath the canopy of ancient cedars and pines. Takeshi moved swiftly but carefully, scanning for signs of Miyuki's passage, a broken twig here, disturbed leaves there, while listening for sounds of pursuit. He found her approximately half a ri into the forest, waiting in the hollow beneath a massive fallen tree. She emerged at his approach, relief evident in her expression. "You're unharmed?" she asked, eyes scanning him for injuries. "For now," he confirmed, "but they know exactly who they're looking for. Someone recognized you and reported to the Miyoshi representatives." Miyuki's face tightened with grim understanding. "Then they won't abandon the search easily. The Miyoshi are thorough in eliminating potential threats, even symbolic ones like the daughter of a disgraced lord." "We need to keep moving," Takeshi said, orienting himself by the glimpses of sky visible through the forest canopy. "North and east, away from the coastal road. There are remote mountain villages where Miyoshi influence is minimal." "That leads us away from Kyoto," Miyuki observed. "For now, yes. When pursuit cools, we can circle back toward our original route." They traveled through the forest for the remainder of the day, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. The hills grew steeper, the forest denser, offering both protection from pursuit and challenges for travel. By evening, they had covered enough ground to risk a small fire, carefully shielded in a rocky outcropping that prevented its light from being visible from more than a few paces away. As they shared the last of their provisions, rice balls and dried fish carefully rationed, Takeshi considered their situation. They had escaped immediate danger, but at significant cost. They were now in remote terrain as winter approached, with minimal supplies, pursued by a powerful clan with reasons both political and personal to capture them. Across the small fire, Miyuki seemed to be following a similar train of thought. "I've brought you nothing but trouble, Takeshi-san," she said quietly. "When you bid at that auction, you couldn't have imagined it would lead to this." "No," he agreed, "but I don't regret it." The simple statement hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Miyuki looked up, studying his face in the firelight, searching for something beyond the words themselves. "Why?" she asked finally. "You've lost everything, your money, your safety, even the modest stability you had built as a ronin, because of me." Takeshi considered the question carefully. Why had he bid for her that rainy day in Mizumoto? Why had he agreed to the journey to Kyoto instead of the more practical route to Hagi? Why was he now facing Miyoshi pursuers for a woman he had known barely a month? "In the years since my lord fell," he said slowly, "I've had survival but not purpose, food and shelter but not meaning. You reminded me that there are things worth protecting beyond one's own life." "A noble sentiment," Miyuki said, her voice gentle but skeptical. "But is one fallen noblewoman truly worth such sacrifice?" "It's not about worth in that sense," Takeshi replied, struggling to articulate feelings he had only begun to understand himself. "It's about choice. I choose to help you reach Kyoto. I choose to face whatever obstacles arise in that journey." He met her gaze directly. "Just as you chose to reveal your true self to me in that woodcutter's hut, when you could have maintained your deception." Miyuki was silent for a long moment, the firelight playing across her features, highlighting the intelligence and strength that her silent persona had partially concealed. "We are both adrift in a changing world," she said finally. "Perhaps we recognize in each other something worth preserving amid the chaos." The observation struck Takeshi as profoundly true. They were indeed both survivors of a collapsing order, both adapting to circumstances neither had chosen, both seeking to preserve some essential part of themselves, even as the world transformed around them. "Get some rest," he advised, setting aside the deeper implications of their conversation for another time. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Those challenges emerged with the dawn, as a light snow began to fall, earlier in the season than usual. The forest took on an ethereal quality, beautiful but treacherous, as visibility decreased and footing became more uncertain. They continued northeast, climbing steadily into higher elevations, where the snowfall intensified. By midday it became clear that they needed to find shelter before the weather worsened further. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and neither was dressed adequately for winter conditions in the mountains. Takeshi led them toward a ridgeline, where he hoped to spot signs of habitation in the valleys beyond. A village, a monastery, even a woodcutter's hut like the one where Miyuki had revealed her true nature. They reached the ridge as the snow began falling more heavily, driving horizontally on a bitter wind that cut through their inadequate clothing. Visibility was poor, but in a valley perhaps 2 ri distant, Takeshi spotted wisps of smoke rising from what appeared to be a small cluster of buildings. "There," he pointed. "If we hurry, we can reach it before dark." The descent was treacherous, the path, little more than a game trail, slippery with snow and hidden obstacles. Twice Miyuki nearly fell, saved only by Takeshi's quick reflexes and steadying hand. By the time they reached the valley floor, both were exhausted, cold seeping into their bodies despite the exertion of the difficult hike. The settlement proved to be smaller than Takeshi had hoped, just 3 modest farmhouses clustered near a stream, with fields now dormant for winter stretching behind them. Smoke rose from only 2 of the houses, suggesting the third was abandoned or used for storage. They approached the nearest occupied dwelling, where an elderly woman was hurriedly gathering firewood from a stack beside the house. She looked up at their approach, surprise and wariness in her weathered face. "Forgive our intrusion," Takeshi called, stopping at a respectful distance. "We are travelers caught unprepared by the early snow. We seek shelter and can offer payment or work in exchange." The woman studied them with sharp eyes that missed nothing despite her advanced age. "You're no ordinary travelers," she observed, noting Takeshi's swords and Miyuki's bearing, despite her travel-worn appearance. "Trouble follows you, I'll wager." "We wish no trouble for your household," Miyuki said, stepping forward and bowing deeply. "But we would be grateful for shelter until the weather clears." The old woman's expression softened slightly at Miyuki's courteous manner. "My son makes these decisions. He'll return from checking the animal pens shortly." She gestured toward the house. "Wait inside. No sense freezing while you plead your case." The interior was simple but well-maintained, with a central hearth where a fire burned steadily, warming the single large room that comprised the main living area. Cooking implements hung from the rafters, storage chests lined the walls, and sleeping mats were neatly rolled in one corner. It was the typical dwelling of mountain farmers, humble but orderly, designed for practicality through long, harsh winters. The old woman busied herself preparing tea, while Takeshi and Miyuki knelt near the fire, gratefully absorbing its warmth. They had just been served the steaming beverage when the door opened to admit a middle-aged man whose powerful build and calloused hands spoke of a lifetime of physical labor. "Mother, the goats are secure, but we should strengthen the south pen before—" He stopped abruptly at the sight of the visitors, hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. "Peace, son," the old woman said calmly. "These travelers seek shelter from the snow. I told them you would decide." The farmer studied them with the same penetrating gaze his mother had displayed. "Your names and business in these mountains?" he asked directly. Takeshi had prepared for this question during their journey. "I am Takeshi, once of the Asakura clan, now Ronin. This is my wife, Miyuki. We journeyed to Kyoto where her mother's family resides." It was close enough to their actual situation to sound convincing, while omitting the dangerous details of Miyuki's lineage and their pursuit by Miyoshi forces. "Asakura," the farmer repeated thoughtfully. "They fell some years back, if I recall. Defeated by an alliance including the Miyoshi, was it not?" "It was," Takeshi confirmed, watching the man carefully for his reaction. After a moment's consideration, the farmer nodded. "I have no love for the Miyoshi. Their tax collectors take more each year while offering less protection." He gestured to the fire. "You may shelter here until the weather clears. In exchange, I expect help with repairs to my goat pens and whatever other tasks need doing." "Agreed," Takeshi said immediately. "We're grateful for your hospitality." "Humph," the farmer grunted, though not unkindly. "Gratitude doesn't mend fences, but willing hands do." He turned to his mother. "Can you make enough stew for 2 more? Or shall I fetch more from the storage house?" "There's plenty," the old woman assured him. "These 2 look like they haven't had a proper meal in days." The assessment was accurate. The simple but hearty stew of root vegetables, dried mountain herbs, and preserved meat that was served later was the most substantial meal they had enjoyed since fleeing the town. After eating, exhaustion claimed them both, and they accepted with gratitude the corner of the room offered for their rest, sleeping deeply despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Morning revealed a transformed landscape, the valley blanketed in white that continued to deepen as snow fell steadily. It quickly became apparent that travel would be impossible until the weather cleared, and some of the accumulation melted. True to his word, Takeshi assisted the farmer, whose name they learned was Ichiro, with repairs to the goat pens and other tasks around the homestead. Miyuki helped Ichiro's mother, Hana, with household duties, displaying a willingness to learn the practical skills of mountain life that clearly impressed the older woman. "You have the hands of a noble, but the heart of a worker," Hana observed on the third day, as Miyuki helped prepare vegetables for pickling. "An unusual combination. Life teaches unexpected lessons," Miyuki replied simply. "I'm fortunate to learn from someone with your experience." The day stretched into a week as the snow continued intermittently, making the steep mountain paths impassable. During this time, they learned more about their hosts, how Ichiro's wife had died in childbirth years earlier, taking their infant son with her, how his younger brother had left for Kyoto seeking opportunity and never returned, how they survived through careful management of their goats, vegetable gardens, and occasional trade with other isolated settlements in the region. In turn, Takeshi and Miyuki shared edited versions of their own histories, careful to avoid details that might endanger their hosts should Miyoshi pursuers eventually track them to the valley. But as days of shared labor and evening conversations accumulated, a genuine respect developed between the two pairs, transcending their different backgrounds and circumstances. On the 10th day of their stay, with the snow finally beginning to melt under clearer skies, a visitor arrived at the homestead, a monk from a small temple located in a neighboring valley, who traveled between the scattered settlements performing rituals and delivering news. The monk, a lean man of indeterminate age named Aisai, was welcomed warmly by Ichiro and Hana, who clearly valued these periodic connections to the wider world. After the customary greetings and offerings of food and tea, the conversation turned to news from beyond the mountains. Travelers are few this time of year, Irisai noted, but a merchant making a late journey through the southern pass mentioned unusual activity on the coastal road. Samurai bearing Miyoshi crests, searching travelers and questioning villagers. His gaze flicked briefly to Takeshi and Miyuki before returning to his hosts. They seek a ronin traveling with a noblewoman, apparently persons of interest to Lord Miyoshi himself. The implication hung in the air, impossible to ignore. Ichiro and Hana exchanged glances but said nothing, waiting to see how their guests would respond to this thinly veiled revelation that their true situation was now suspected. Takeshi met the monk's evaluating gaze directly. Such persons would indeed have reason for concern, given Miyoshi's reputation for thoroughness in eliminating perceived threats. Indeed, Aisai agreed mildly, though one might question what threat a single noblewoman and her protector could pose to so powerful a lord. "Symbols can be powerful," Miyuki said quietly, "particularly in uncertain times." The monk studied her with new interest, noting perhaps the refined speech and posture that her simple clothing and willingness to perform household labor could not entirely disguise. "You speak wisely," he acknowledged. "The old order changes, and those who represented it, for good or ill, become focal points for both resistance and reform." Ichiro cleared his throat, breaking the increasingly tense atmosphere. "Brother Aisai, you mentioned performing a blessing for the new goat pens. Perhaps we should attend to that while daylight remains." As the men left the house, Hana turned to Miyuki with a direct gaze that brooked no evasion. "You are Tachibana, aren't you? The daughter who survived when her father's house fell." Miyuki hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, though I no longer claim the name or position. And yet the Miyoshi hunt you still." It was a statement, not a question. "They fear what you represent, even without lands or title. They fear the alliances that might form around what I represent," Miyuki corrected. "The potential for resistance to their expansion, centered on a legitimate grievance against their methods." Hana nodded slowly, understanding perfectly the political calculations involved. Despite her isolation and humble circumstances, the old woman clearly possessed both intelligence and insight into the workings of power. "You should speak with Brother Aisai privately before he departs," she advised. "His temple maintains connections throughout the region, including mountain passes that avoid the usual routes to Kyoto." And while he presents himself as a simple monk, he was once a warrior himself, with his own reasons to oppose Miyoshi influence. When Takeshi and the others returned from blessing the goat pens, Miyuki sought an opportunity to speak with Eisai alone, following Hana's advice. They walked to the edge of the cleared area around the homestead, where melting snow dripped from cedar branches in a gentle percussion. "You were not always a monk," Miyuki observed, once they were beyond earshot of the others. Eisai smiled slightly. "Just as you were not always a fugitive, Lady Tachibana. What gave me away? Several small things. Your posture when at rest. The particular way you hold chopsticks. The unconscious grace with which you perform even mundane tasks." His smile deepened. "I served in a daimyo's court before taking vows. One develops an eye for such details." "And now?" Miyuki asked. "Where do your loyalties lie? With those who seek to live with dignity regardless of station." He glanced back toward the house where Ichiro and Hana could be seen through the open door, preparing the evening meal. These good people have no part in the games of lords and clans, yet they suffer the consequences of distant ambitions. My loyalty is to them and others like them. It was a diplomatic answer, but not, Miyuki sensed, a dishonest one. "We seek only to reach Kyoto safely," she said. "We have no ambition to challenge the Miyoshi directly. Yet your very survival represents such a challenge in their eyes." Eisai studied her thoughtfully. "The temple where I reside maintains a network of paths through these mountains, known primarily to those who have reason to avoid more traveled routes. Some lead eventually to Kyoto, though the journey is not easy, especially in winter. We would be grateful for guidance," Miyuki said carefully. "I will provide a map and directions before I depart tomorrow," the monk promised. "But I would offer counsel as well, if you would hear it. Please, consider carefully what awaits you in Kyoto. The capital is not immune to Miyoshi influence. Indeed, their power has grown significantly there in recent years. Your mother's family, however distant, may be watched if there is any suspicion of connection to the Tachibana." It was a sobering thought, and one Miyuki had considered during their journey, but pushed aside in favor of more immediate concerns. "What alternative would you suggest?" Eisai gestured toward the surrounding mountains. "There are communities throughout these regions where skilled individuals can build new lives, far from political entanglements. Your education need not be employed only in noble houses or capital tea rooms." "You suggest abandoning my name and history entirely? I suggest considering whether carrying that burden serves any purpose beyond satisfying Miyoshi fears that it might." Eisai's expression was compassionate but direct. "The question is not whether you are Tachibana, but whether being recognized as such helps or hinders the life you wish to build now." The monk's words resonated with thoughts Miyuki had begun to harbor herself during their journey, particularly since witnessing the simple but dignified life Ichiro and Hana had created in their mountain valley. What truly remained of her family legacy beyond the name itself? And was that name worth the danger it brought not only to her, but to those who helped her? "I will reflect on your counsel," she promised. "Good. And your protector, the Ronin who purchased you at auction." Miyuki glanced toward where Takeshi was assisting Ichiro with bringing in firewood. "What of him?" "He has forsaken much to accompany you. Does he share your destination or merely your journey?" It was a perceptive question that cut to the heart of an uncertainty Miyuki had been reluctant to examine too closely. What would become of their relationship once they reached Kyoto? If she found sanctuary with her mother's family, what place would there be for a Ronin whose only connection to her was an impulsive purchase at a village auction? "I don't know," she admitted. "We have not discussed what happens after Kyoto." Eisai nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "Perhaps that conversation is overdue. Mountain winters provide ample opportunity for reflection and honest words." The following morning, true to his promise, Eisai provided detailed instructions for mountain paths that would eventually lead to Kyoto, while avoiding the more traveled routes where Miyoshi samurai might maintain checkpoints or patrols. The journey would be longer and more challenging, particularly in winter conditions, but offered greater safety from pursuit. The snow should continue to melt over the next few days if the clear weather holds, the monk advised as he prepared to depart. But I would not delay too long. Winter in the high mountains is unforgiving to the unprepared. After bidding farewell to Aisai, Takeshi and Miyuki spent the day helping Ichiro and Hana with various tasks around the homestead, conscious that they would soon resume their journey. As evening approached, Miyuki found herself alone with Takeshi for the first time in days as they collected water from the stream that ran behind the house. "The monk provided you with guidance for mountain routes?" Takeshi asked as he filled a wooden bucket. "Yes, he believes we can reach Kyoto safely if we follow certain paths, though the journey will be difficult." Takeshi nodded, seemingly satisfied with this practical information. But Miyuki, remembering Aisai's counsel about overdue conversations, gathered her courage to address the deeper question that had begun to preoccupy her. "Takeshi-san," she began, setting down her own water container, "when we reach Kyoto, if I find my mother's family and they accept me, what will you do?" He looked up, clearly surprised by the directness of her question. "I hadn't thought beyond ensuring your safe arrival," he admitted after a moment. "That's not entirely true," Miyuki pressed gently. "You must have considered what comes after." Takeshi straightened, his expression thoughtful as he gazed at the stream flowing steadily, despite the winter landscape around it. "I assumed I would continue as I have these past years," he said finally, "finding work where I can, moving on when necessary." "Alone again," Miyuki observed, "as I was before Mizumoto." His tone was carefully neutral, revealing nothing of how he felt about returning to that solitary existence. Miyuki took a deep breath, steeling herself for vulnerability. And if there were an alternative, if completion of our journey to Kyoto didn't necessarily mean the end of our association? Now Takeshi turned to face her fully, searching her expression for the meaning behind her carefully chosen words. "What alternative do you envision?" "I don't know precisely," she admitted, "but these weeks of travel, of shared danger and purpose, they have changed me, changed how I see my future." She met his gaze directly. "I'm no longer certain that Kyoto and my mother's family represent the only path forward." "What other path exists for someone with your background and education?" he asked, though his tone suggested he might already suspect her answer. "Perhaps one we create ourselves." The words came more easily now, giving voice to thoughts that had been forming since their conversation with Aisai. "There are remote regions where Miyoshi influence is minimal, where skills and knowledge are valued, regardless of family names or past affiliations. You would abandon your quest to restore the Tachibana legacy." "I've come to question whether that legacy exists anywhere but in my memories," Miyuki said softly. "My father sold me at auction. My brothers died in a conflict most now regard as settled history. What remains except a name that brings danger without corresponding benefit?" Takeshi was silent for a long moment, absorbing the significance of what she was suggesting. "And you believe we could build something worthwhile, away from the centers of power and politics?" "I believe we already have begun to," she replied. "When you purchased me at that auction, neither of us could have imagined the journey that would follow. Yet here we stand, having faced challenges together that would have overwhelmed either of us alone." The simple truth of this observation hung between them, accompanied by the gentle sound of flowing water and the calls of evening birds preparing to roost. Takeshi took a step toward her, close enough that she could see the play of emotions across his usually composed features: surprise, consideration, and something warmer that made her heart quicken. "I purchased a deaf-mute noblewoman," he said quietly. "Instead, I found a partner of courage and intelligence who challenges me to see beyond the limitations I had accepted for myself." "And I was sold to a ronin," Miyuki responded, her voice equally soft, "only to discover a man of honor and principle, whose loyalty transcends the clan structures that defined it." The moment stretched between them, weighted with unspoken possibility. Then Takeshi reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished, and touched her cheek with a gentleness that belied his warrior's hands. "If we set aside our past identities," he said, "what remains?" "Only ourselves," Miyuki answered, "and whatever we choose to build together." The simple declaration seemed to resolve something within Takeshi. His expression cleared, decision replacing uncertainty. then perhaps our journey's purpose has changed, not to restore what was lost, but to discover what might be created. Before Miyuki could respond, a shout from the direction of the house broke the moment. Ichiro was calling them, urgency evident in his voice. They grabbed the water containers and hurried back, only to find their host pointing toward the ridge they had crossed days earlier. "Riders," he said grimly. 6, maybe 7, armed and moving with purpose. Takeshi scanned the distant figures, barely visible in the fading light. Miyoshi? Who else would venture into these mountains in winter with such numbers? Ichiro turned to them, his expression grave. They must have followed Brother Aisai's trail to our valley. The implications were immediately clear. Their sanctuary was compromised, and their hosts now endangered by association. Miyuki felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the winter air. "We need to leave immediately," she said. "Our presence puts you and your mother at risk." "Nonsense," Hana interjected from the doorway. "Night approaches, and the temperature will drop quickly. Setting out now would be suicide, regardless of who those riders might be." "She's right," Ichiro agreed. "Besides, there's nowhere you could go that they wouldn't find tracks in the snow by morning." "Then what do you suggest?" Takeshi asked, his hand unconsciously moving to his katana's hilt. Ichiro's expression turned calculating. "The abandoned house at the valley's edge. It was my uncle's before he died last winter. It's falling into disrepair, but the root cellar beneath it remains sound and hidden. If you shelter there tonight, I can misdirect any inquiries." It was a risky plan, dependent on Ichiro's ability to convince potentially suspicious samurai that he had seen no travelers matching their description. But, as Hana had pointed out, alternatives were few and danger imminent. "We accept your offer," Takeshi decided. "But if questioning turns to threats, you must reveal our location. I'll not have your lives endangered for our sake." "Let me worry about my own household," Ichiro replied gruffly. "Now gather your belongings quickly. They'll reach the valley floor within the hour." Guided by Ichiro, they made their way to the abandoned house as dusk deepened into true darkness. The structure was indeed in poor condition, its roof partially collapsed on one side, windows empty of paper or shutters. But the entrance to the root cellar was intact, concealed beneath old straw matting in what had once been the main room. The cellar itself was surprisingly spacious, dug deep into the earth to maintain cool temperatures for storing vegetables through the mountain summers. Now it was nearly empty, with only a few forgotten baskets and crocks lining the earthen walls. A small oil lamp provided by Hana cast just enough light to see by once Ichiro had closed the trap door above them. "Remain absolutely silent," he instructed in a whisper. "Sound carries strangely in the valley at night. I'll return when it's safe." Then he was gone, leaving them alone in the dim, chilly space that smelled of earth and old vegetables. Takeshi spread one of their blankets on the dirt floor, and they sat close together for warmth, listening intently for any sounds from above. For what seemed like hours, they heard nothing beyond the occasional creak of the deteriorating structure above them. Then, just as Miyuki was beginning to hope the riders might have passed through the valley without stopping at the homesteads, faint voices and the distinctive sound of horses' hooves became audible. Takeshi's hand found hers in the near darkness, squeezing gently in silent reassurance. They strained to make out words, but the distance and the muffling effect of the earth around them rendered the voices indistinct, until a sudden, sharp cry of pain cut through the night. Miyuki's grip on Takeshi's hand tightened convulsively. That had been Ichiro's voice. Without hesitation, Takeshi moved toward the trapdoor, but Miyuki held him back. "Wait," she whispered, her lips close to his ear. "If they're torturing him for information, appearing now only guarantees his suffering was for nothing." It was brutal logic, but undeniable. They had no way of knowing how many samurai were at the homestead or what exactly was happening. Rushing in blindly might only result in more violence with no guarantee of saving their hosts. More voices, louder now, though still unintelligible. Then the unmistakable sound of someone approaching the abandoned house, feet crunching on snow and frozen ground. Takeshi drew his katana silently, positioning himself between Miyuki and the trapdoor. They waited, scarcely breathing, as footsteps moved across the floor above them, accompanied by the sound of debris being kicked aside during a cursory search. The footsteps paused directly above the root cellar. A moment of terrible silence followed, during which Miyuki could hear only the pounding of her own heart. Then the matting was pulled away and the trapdoor lifted, flooding their hiding place with torchlight. Takeshi tensed, prepared to strike, only to relax marginally as Hana's weathered face appeared in the opening. "Quickly!" she hissed. "They've taken Ichiro for further questioning at their camp on the ridge. This may be our only chance." They scrambled up from the cellar to find night fully fallen, the valley illuminated only by moonlight reflecting off the snow. In the distance, they could see torches moving up the slope toward the ridge where the Miyoshi samurai had presumably established a temporary camp. "What happened?" Miyuki asked urgently as they gathered their few possessions. "They showed your likenesses. Ink drawings surprisingly accurate," Hana explained, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Claimed you were criminals, sought for theft and murder, but their manner belied the story. Ichiro denied seeing anyone matching the descriptions, but they didn't believe him." Her voice faltered. "They're taking him to their captain for more intensive questioning." The implication was clear and horrifying. Torture was not uncommon in extracting information from reluctant sources, especially when samurai pursued objectives they deemed important to their lord's interests. "We'll go after them," Takeshi decided immediately. "Create a diversion to free Ichiro before they reach their camp." "No," Hana shook her head firmly. "That's exactly what they expect. The one who seemed in charge, he left only 3 men to take Ichiro up the mountain. The others are surely hidden, watching to see if anyone emerges to attempt a rescue." "Then what do you suggest?" Miyuki asked. "Oh, we can't abandon him to torture and possible death for helping us." "You must take the hidden path through the western ravine," Hana said, already moving toward the back of the property where a narrow trail vanished into the darkness between towering cedars. "It bypasses the ridge entirely and connects with the route Brother Aisai marked on your map. By dawn, you can be beyond their search area." "And Ichiro," Takeshi pressed, "I will claim he lied to protect me, out of filial duty, that I encountered you on my way to gather herbs days ago and concealed your presence from him." Hana's expression was resolute. "They are more likely to believe a frightened old woman would be deceived by fugitives than that a grown man would knowingly harbor criminals." "They may still punish him," Miyuki warned. "Less severely than if they believe he actively conspired with you," Hana replied, "and they are unlikely to harm an old woman. It brings no honor and serves no purpose once they have what they seek." The strategy was sound, if painful to accept. By fleeing immediately, they would draw pursuit away from the valley, giving Hana the opportunity to present her alternative narrative to the Miyoshi captain. "Take this." Hana pressed a small bundle into Miyuki's hands. "Food for 3 days, if you're careful. And this." She removed a jade magatama from around her neck, surprisingly fine for a mountain farmer's mother. "Show it at the temple marked on Brother Aisai's map. They will know you come with his blessing." "This is too valuable," Miyuki began to protest. "It has served its purpose in my life," Hana interrupted. "Perhaps it will find new meaning in yours." She turned to Takeshi. "Protect each other, not just one another. There is a difference." With those cryptic words, she urged them toward the western trail, refusing further discussion or gratitude. As they entered the darkness of the forest path, Miyuki looked back once to see the old woman, walking with determined steps toward the torches, moving up the distant slope, a solitary figure of surprising strength, preparing to face armed samurai with nothing but her wits and a mother's love for her son. The western ravine path was treacherous in the darkness, a narrow track that wound between boulders and across small streams partially frozen with winter's advance. They moved as quickly as safety allowed, guided by occasional glimpses of moonlight through the forest canopy, and Takeshi's remarkable ability to sense the path even when it was barely visible. By dawn, as Hana had predicted, they had put considerable distance between themselves and the valley, emerging onto a broader trail that corresponded with Aisai's map. They paused briefly to rest and consult the monk's directions, confirming they were now on a route that would eventually lead them south toward Kyoto, while avoiding the more traveled ways where Miyoshi patrols might operate. "We should continue until midday," Takeshi suggested, studying the terrain ahead. "Find a defensible location to rest properly before pressing on." Miyuki nodded agreement, too exhausted for conversation after the night's events. The emotional weight of what had transpired, Ichiro's capture, Hana's sacrifice, their own narrow escape, pressed upon her as heavily as physical fatigue. They had brought danger to people who had shown them nothing but kindness, a burden that sat uneasily on her conscience. They traveled in silence for several hours, the path gradually descending from the highest elevations to a more moderate mountain landscape. By midday they reached a small plateau, where a rocky overhang created natural shelter, protected from the wind and difficult to approach unseen from any direction. As they ate sparingly from the provisions Hana had provided, Miyuki finally gave voice to the thoughts that had preoccupied her throughout the morning's journey. "We can't continue this way," she said quietly, "endangering others, living as fugitives, always one step ahead of pursuit." Takeshi looked up from the map he had been studying. "What alternative exists while the Miyoshi hunt you?" "Perhaps we've been approaching this wrongly," Miyuki replied, an idea taking shape as she spoke. "We've been attempting to outrun or hide from the pursuit, but what if we remove their reason to pursue instead? The only way to do that would be—" Takeshi stopped, understanding dawning in his expression. "You're suggesting allowing them to believe they've succeeded, that the last Tachibana is no more." "Exactly." Miyuki leaned forward earnestly. "If the Miyoshi received convincing evidence of my death, their hunt would end. The symbolic threat I represent would be eliminated. Creating such evidence without actually dying presents considerable challenges," Takeshi observed dryly. "And the Miyoshi are unlikely to accept rumors or second-hand reports." "True," Miyuki acknowledged. "But Brother Aisai mentioned a temple on our route, the one Hana's Magatama would grant us access to. Perhaps there lies our opportunity." Takeshi studied her thoughtfully. "You've changed," he said after a moment. "The woman I purchased at auction would never have considered abandoning her family name and legacy so completely." "The woman you purchased was already a fiction," Miyuki reminded him with a small smile. "A deaf-mute noblewoman created by her father's desperation. Perhaps it's time to shed fictions entirely and discover what truth remains." The simple wisdom of this statement seemed to resonate with Takeshi, who nodded slowly. "Very well. We continue to the temple and explore what possibilities exist there. But if no viable option emerges, we resume our journey to Kyoto as planned." They reached the temple late the following day, a modest complex nestled against a mountainside, partially hidden by ancient cedars. Unlike the grander establishments in more populous regions, this temple had a weathered, practical appearance, clearly a working spiritual center rather than a destination for wealthy pilgrims seeking blessings or political advantage. The monk who greeted them at the gate was initially reserved, his eyes noting Takeshi's swords and their travel-worn appearance with cautious assessment. But when Miyuki produced Hana's Magatama, his demeanor changed immediately. "You come from the Northern Valley," he stated, rather than asked, "and with Brother Aisai's knowledge." "Yes," Miyuki confirmed, "though circumstances forced us to leave." Abruptly. The monk's expression revealed nothing, but he opened the gate wider. "Come. The abbot will wish to speak with you." They were led through the temple grounds to a small building separate from the main hall, where the abbot, an elderly man with a serenity that seemed to emanate from him like warmth from a fire, received them with simple hospitality. Hot tea, a modest meal, and unobtrusive attentiveness to their trail-weary condition. Only when they had eaten and refreshed themselves did he inquire about their journey. Miyuki, sensing an unusual degree of receptiveness and discretion in their host, chose honesty over the careful half-truths they had employed elsewhere. "I am Miyuki of the Tachibana," she began, noting the lack of surprise in the abbot's eyes at this revelation. "Pursued by Miyoshi forces, who see in my continued existence a symbol of resistance to their expansion. The Miyoshi are indeed most thorough in eliminating potential opposition," the abbot observed mildly, "even when that opposition exists more in their imagination than in reality." "Precisely," Miyuki agreed, "which has led us to consider a different approach to our dilemma." She outlined the concept they had discussed, creating convincing evidence of her death that would satisfy Miyoshi agents and end the pursuit, allowing them to build new lives away from political entanglements. The abbot listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Miyuki finished, he was silent for a long moment before addressing Takeshi. "And you, samurai, you support this plan to abandon names and histories that have defined you both." "I support her freedom to choose her own path," Takeshi replied simply, "and I have found that names and histories can become burdens as easily as blessings." The abbot nodded, as if this answer confirmed something important. "What you propose is not without precedent. In troubled times, many have sought to shed old identities weighted with dangerous associations." He stroked his thin beard thoughtfully. "This temple maintains connections with monastic communities throughout the region, including some that are not strictly religious in nature, havens for those seeking to leave behind complex pasts." "You would help us?" Miyuki asked, hope rising within her. "If your resolve is genuine, yes." The abbot's gaze was penetrating but not unkind. "But such transformations require more than simple disguise or geographic relocation. To truly leave behind who you were, you must be prepared to become someone new in all ways, appearance, manner, daily practices." "We understand," Takeshi said, though Miyuki detected a hint of uncertainty in his tone that mirrored her own inner hesitation. The abbot seemed to sense their ambivalence. "Reflect on your decision tonight. True resolve will only come when you have confronted and accepted all that you stand to lose, along with what you hope to gain." They were shown to a small guest quarter, simple but clean, where sleeping mats had been prepared on opposite sides of the room in accordance with propriety. As night settled over the temple, bringing with it the rhythmic sounds of distant chanting from the main hall, Miyuki found herself unable to sleep, the abbot's words echoing in her mind. What would she truly lose by abandoning the Tachibana name? Her family was gone, their lands seized, their political influence extinguished. All that remained was a history increasingly irrelevant to the Japan emerging around them, and a target on her back that endangered not only herself, but anyone who assisted her. And what would she gain? Freedom from pursuit. The chance to build something new based on her own choices, rather than the circumstances of her birth or the political calculations of others. And perhaps most significantly, a future shared with the man who had demonstrated through action, rather than words, that her welfare mattered to him. Across the room, Takeshi seemed equally restless, his breathing betraying wakefulness despite the late hour. "Takeshi-san," she said softly, "are you certain about this path? It asks much of you as well." "What does it ask that I haven't already given?" he replied, his voice equally quiet in the darkness. "I left behind my clan identity 3 years ago when my lord fell. Since then, I have been defined more by absence than presence, a samurai without master, a warrior without battles worth fighting. And now, how would you define yourself?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Perhaps as someone who has found purpose in protection rather than combat, in building rather than serving." Another pause, briefer. "In companionship rather than duty." The simple honesty of his words touched Miyuki deeply. In their weeks together, through danger and hardship, something profound had developed between them, a connection based not on transaction or circumstance, but on mutual recognition of qualities that transcended their disparate origins. "If we do this," she said, "we truly leave everything behind, not just names and histories, but the very frameworks that have ordered our understanding of the world. Samurai and noble, master and servant, protector and protected, all must be reimagined." "Is that not what we have already begun?" Takeshi asked. "Since the moment you spoke in that woodcutter's hut, revealing yourself as neither deaf nor mute, we have been reimagining the boundaries between us." It was true, Miyuki realized. From that moment of honest revelation, their relationship had evolved beyond the roles assigned by their initial meeting at the auction. They had become partners in survival, then in purpose, and now potentially in creating a shared future neither could have envisioned weeks earlier. "Yes," she agreed softly. "And perhaps that is the truest freedom, to define ourselves and our connection to one another on our own terms, not those inherited or imposed." Morning brought clarity and decision. When they met again with the abbot, both Miyuki and Takeshi had resolved to pursue the path of transformation, to create new identities that would allow them to live without the constant shadow of Miyoshi pursuit. The abbot, sensing their determination, outlined a plan both simple and profound. The temple would arrange for evidence of Miyuki's death to reach Miyoshi agents, a carefully staged encounter with bandits on a mountain pass, leaving items that would be recognizable as hers, along with enough ambiguity about the body's fate to discourage detailed investigation. The Miyoshi are pragmatic, the abbot explained. Once convinced their objective has been achieved, they will not expend further resources confirming details that do not affect the political outcome they sought. Meanwhile, Miyuki and Takeshi would travel to a remote community in the mountains west of Kyoto, a settlement of farmers, craftspeople, and others who had chosen to live outside traditional power structures, many of them carrying histories similar to their own. It is called Mizuho, the abbot told them. Not on any official maps, known only to those with reason to seek it. They are always in need of individuals with useful skills, farming, carpentry, medicine. He looked at Miyuki. And education. Many there value learning despite their remote circumstances. The preparations took nearly 2 weeks. Miyuki's appearance was altered, her hair cut even shorter in the style of a Buddhist nun, her skin darkened slightly with walnut stain to suggest a life spent working outdoors rather than sheltered in noble houses. Takeshi too underwent changes, allowing his beard to grow and adopting the clothing and demeanor of a farmer rather than a warrior, though he kept his swords, now wrapped in plain cloth to disguise their quality. They were given new names, new background stories consistent with the community they would join, and practical instruction in skills that would support their revised identities. Throughout this process, they worked closely together, helping each other adapt to unfamiliar mannerisms and perspectives, strengthening the partnership that had developed during their journey. Finally, the day arrived for their departure. The abbot provided them with a map to Mizuho, letters of introduction to the community's leaders, and practical provisions for the journey. "The path you have chosen is not an easy one," he told them as they prepared to leave. "To remake oneself requires constant vigilance against old habits of thought and action, but it also offers possibilities unavailable to those constrained by inherited identities." "We understand," Miyuki, now called Hisa, replied, "and we are grateful for your guidance." "One last thing," the abbot said, reaching into his robe. He withdrew a simple cord from which hung 2 half magatama, carved from the same piece of jade, designed to fit together to form a complete whole. A tradition in Mizuho for those who arrive together, having shed old lives to build new ones in partnership. Takeshi, now known as Kenji, accepted the token with a formal bow. "We will honor its meaning." They departed as dawn broke over the mountains, following a path that would lead them not to Kyoto and the remnants of Miyuki's family connections, but to Mizuho and the possibility of creating something entirely new. The journey would be challenging, the destination uncertain in its particulars. But as they walked side by side rather than one before the other, they carried with them the knowledge that whatever awaited, they would face it together, no longer defined by the transaction at a rainy auction where a lonely samurai had paid 2 ryo for a princess with a sack on her head, but by the choices they made and the future they would build with their own hands. In Mizuho, they found not perfection but possibility, a community where skills and contribution mattered more than lineage or past affiliations. Hisa established a small school, teaching children and adults alike the knowledge she had once acquired for very different purposes. Kenji turned his disciplined mind and body to farming and community protection, eventually becoming one of the settlement's respected elders. They were married in the mountain style during their first spring in Mizuho, the ceremony simple but profound, witnessed by their new neighbors who knew nothing of Tachibana nobility or Asakura samurai, but valued the qualities they demonstrated daily: resilience, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to one another. Years later, when Miyoshi power had waned and new conflicts had reshaped the political landscape, a monk passing through Mizuho brought news that the last Tachibana daughter was still believed dead, her name now merely a footnote in the complex history of clan warfare. The monk, none other than Aisai himself, aged but still traveling his mountain circuit, shared a private meal with the couple known to their community as Kenji and Hisa. "Do you ever regret your choice?" he asked as they sat together in the simple but comfortable home they had built with their own hands. "The abandonment of names and positions that once defined you?" Hisa and Kenji exchanged a glance, their comfortable silence communicating decades of shared experience. On the wall behind them hung their joined magatama, symbolic of the union they had forged from disparate beginnings. "How can we regret becoming who we truly are?" Hisa replied finally. "Everything of value came after we set aside what others had determined we should be." Kenji nodded agreement, his weathered hand covering hers on the table between them. "The auction was not the beginning of our story, but merely the moment our paths converged. What matters is the journey we chose to make together." As Aisai departed the following morning, continuing his perpetual circuit of mountain communities, he carried with him the image of two people who had transformed what could have been tragedy into opportunity, what could have been mere survival into genuine flourishing. In a world increasingly defined by change and uncertainty, they had discovered perhaps the most valuable skill of all, the ability to reimagine not just circumstances, but themselves. The lonely samurai who had paid his last coins for a deaf princess sold by her drunk father had indeed discovered she could hear. But more importantly, they had both learned to listen to each other, to the possibilities that lay beyond inherited expectations, and to the quiet voice of their shared future, calling them forward into lives of their own making.